The day the pavement fought the river. The first sign wasn't a roar, it was a sigh. Just a soft, wet depression in the land near the old willow tree at the edge of the community park. Most people wouldn't have noticed that gentle sag, a mirrored pool refusing to drain hours after a light spring rain, but I'm not most people, am I? 26 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, mapping floodplains in Louisiana, reinforcing berms in Kandahar. I've seen what happens when soil loses its memory, and I knew right then, standing there in my old combat boots, that the ground beneath our quaint little subdivision, Willow Creek Heights, was starting to get tired. I spent the afternoon walking the perimeter, a laser level in one hand, a notebook in the other, feeling a familiar tightness in my chest. It wasn't just a natural dip. It was the beginning of a collapse, a slow-motion sinkhole waiting for the right tropical storm to come along and finish the job. This place, our perfect manicured little slice of suburbia, was built directly over a historic seasonal creek basin. The park was supposed to be the sponge, the fail-safe, the place where the runoff could sigh into the earth. But something beneath it had choked. The next evening, I presented my findings at the monthly HOA meeting held in the stuffy clubhouse, smelling faintly of stale coffee and passive aggression. Brenda Hayes, our HOA president, a woman whose smile was as sharp as her legal degree, opened the floor talking about new flower beds and a Zen garden near the duck pond. I stood up, my binder of photos and calculations feeling like a cinder block in my hands. "Ma'am, I need 5 minutes and not for flower arrangements," I said, trying to keep the Afghanistan out of my voice. "The subsurface drainage near Sector 4 has failed, the land is subsiding, and your plan to pave that area for benches will turn our natural runoff basin into a concrete slip and slide. We need a geo-survey now before summer hits." Brenda didn't even look at the binder. She just gave me that polished, practiced look of serene annoyance. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "is this the same alarmist rhetoric you brought up last month about the curb height? We've already consulted with our landscaping team and they assure us the soil is perfectly stable. We appreciate your enthusiasm and your service to our country, but we won't allow fear-mongering to derail our property value enhancement plan." A ripple of nervous, dismissive laughter went around the room, led by Craig Jenkins, the vice president, a guy who probably thought a French drain was something they installed at Versailles. I sat back down, the shame not for myself, but for the predictable blindness of bureaucracy. I didn't stop, of course. I emailed the full report, cross-referencing county flood maps and drone footage, showing the water lingering longer with every passing drizzle. I got the dreaded out-of-office reply, the kind that bounces back 3 days later because the whole board had updated their contact info without notice. I printed a hard copy, tabbed it meticulously, and slid it under the clubhouse door. The next morning I found it, torn in half, stuffed into my mailbox like a discarded receipt. They weren't just ignoring me. They were waging a small, petty war. Then came the official warning. An HOA violation notice taped to my front door for unapproved alterations to front property drainage systems. The little gravel swale I'd dug by my foundation, barely visible from the street, designed to channel water away from my house, was now a code violation. They fined me $300. I looked at that fine and realized they weren't worried about water. They were worried about power. They saw my clipboard and my experience as a direct challenge to their perfectly paved, perfectly boring little kingdom. Brenda and Craig were sealing their own fate, and the fate of everyone in the lower basin simply because they couldn't stand being wrong. So I stopped arguing. When the world won't listen, you build in silence. That was a lesson I learned a long time ago in a mud-soaked fob. I didn't pay the fine, but I wrote a cold, legal letter to the HOA's council, citing state property codes and attaching my notarized submission to the County Public Works database, my insurance policy. Then I went to work. I spent 3 weekends regrading my yard with a long aluminum level and a rake, moving tons of earth by hand to ensure the slope was precisely angled away from my foundation. I trenched and buried PVC pipes, extending my downspouts underground into a hidden, deep, dry well lined with river rock and filter fabric, all camouflaged beneath my little vegetable garden. I called it my ghost system, perfectly functional, perfectly invisible, and perfectly legal once it was buried deep enough. I replaced the old sump pump with a high-capacity, dual-pump system connected to a solar-powered battery backup. I cut marine-grade plywood panels for my basement windows and kept 5 sandbags and a collapsible water barrier stacked in my shed. While Brenda was picking out decorative lights shaped like dragonflies for her new paved walkway, I was bracing for the apocalypse. The forecast finally whispered about it, a tropical disturbance stalling in the Gulf, tracking north. I checked the barometric pressure, watched it drop like a stone, and I knew. I watched them roll the vibratory compactor over that new paved walkway, sealing the earth tighter and tighter, thud, 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 erasing the last bit of sponge-like resistance. They were finishing their masterpiece, a beautiful, useless death trap. The storm hit on a Monday afternoon, not with a crashing fury, but with a terrifying, silent efficiency. 2 inches of rain an hour, relentless. By 4 p.m., the street looked like a lazy river, gurgling from the drains that were already choked. But the true horror was the park. The new pavers, slick and gleaming, did exactly what I said they would. They acted like a mirror, reflecting every drop outward, turning the once sponge into a concrete dam. The water had nowhere to go but up and out. I stood on my porch, my pumps humming quietly, my ghost system working flawlessly. The line of water stopped precisely at the berm I'd secretly built. My yard was dry. Then I heard the first sound of panic. A high, desperate scream from down near Birch Lane. I saw headlights bouncing in the rising floodwater, a sedan stuck, the water already up to the doors. And then I saw the surge. The water, relentless, gushed over the curb, cascading through the side yards of the lowest homes, including Brenda's and Craig's. It looked like a miniature waterfall, a terrifying, gurgling apology from nature. I slogged out into the waist-deep street, grabbing my strongest flashlight. I found Craig, the smug vice president, knee-deep in water near his ruined garage, trying to pry open a drain grate with his bare hands. "It's no use," I yelled over the wind. "The drain's sealed! The runoff's coming from the park!" He turned, rain streaking down his face, his eyes wide and terrified. The man who called me paranoid was looking at me like I was the last sane person on earth. What do we do?" he screamed. For a flash of a second, the bitter laughter was right there on my tongue, but I swallowed it. "Sandbags! Get everything out of your first floor, now!" I fought my way to the corner junction where the main drain pipe should have been. I dug with my gloved hands through mud and debris until my fingers hit the smooth edge of concrete. They hadn't just paved over it. They had drilled and filled the pipe with cement. They had buried the one lifeline this land ever had. By midnight, the storm had passed. The neighborhood was silent, dark, save for the blue flashes of emergency crews and the haunting, continuous drip of water. I sat on my dry porch, exhausted, not feeling triumph, but a heavy, weary grief. I hadn't wanted to be right. Not like this. The morning after was still heavy with the smell of wet drywall and ruin. Karen's, Brenda's house, the centerpiece of the HOA's vanity, was stained with a thick mud line 2 feet up the siding, her shutters hanging crooked like broken wings. The decorative pavers were a submerged, useless mosaic under a foot of brown water. I was helping a few neighbors with my spare pump, people who wouldn't look me in the eye when they said thank you, when Craig approached me. He looked rough, his jeans soaked, holding a soggy HOA binder in a plastic bag. He just stood there by his ruined Mustang, his pride and joy now sitting in fetid water. "Your house. It's untouched," he muttered. "It is," I said simply. He stared at me for a long, shame-filled moment, then his shoulders sagged. "I should have listened," he whispered. I didn't offer a lecture. I offered a hand. "I've got a dehumidifier and a commercial-grade pump. Take it! You'd still help?" "I didn't warn you out of spite," I said, looking out at the wreckage. "I warned you because it was the right thing to do." That hasn't changed. The investigation was swift. The county public works arrived armed with my reports, and within hours they found the sealed drain. The board was hit with massive fines for tampering with public infrastructure, and Brenda, the polished president, resigned via a 3-word email at 5:47 a.m. I hereby resign. The new board, led by a deeply humbled former critic named Sarah, voted to tear up the pavers and excavate the drain line. They stood in the clubhouse, shame etched on their faces, and asked me to take the role of flood mitigation director. I politely declined. I will help you as a neighbor, I told them, but I won't wear a title that should have been offered months ago, not after the damage was done. In the fall, the city came through. They cleared the old line, expanded it, and restored the basin with native plants. The neighborhood began to breathe again. One crisp December morning, I walked the edge of the restored park. It was soft again, rich with new mulch. And there, by the trailhead, was a small, tasteful sign, hand-painted. It read, "The Peterson Reserve Community Green Space and Runoff Zone." It wasn't a plaque. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a bruise that turned into a lesson. The flood didn't break us. It revealed what was already broken. The arrogance, the denial, the sheer inability to listen to the quiet, uncomfortable truth. Brenda and Craig sold their ruined homes and moved away, victims of their own pride. But the rest of us stayed, because sometimes you need to lose everything to finally find out what's holding the community together. Tell me, have you ever seen that kind of willful blindness in your own neighborhood association, or maybe even at your work? And if you were me, after all that, would you have still offered Craig that spare pump? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the things we learn when we finally stop fighting the earth.